Hi, my name's Lee Jasper. This is Brixton, London, and you're watching Lee Jasper Drive Time.
Hello and good morning, people. We're live on Facebook and YouTube this morning. My name's Lee Jasper. I'm the host of Lee Jasper Drive Time. This is the 8th. I can't believe it. We've done 8 weeks solid so far, every Saturday between 10 and 12, bringing you discussion programs on issues and themes that are important to the Black community here in the United Kingdom and indeed around the world. And our program this morning is no different, bringing you quality information, education, and illumination on the Lee Jasper Drive Time. First of all, I'd like to just take a little moment, if I may, to ask you to share and let people know that we are live. If you've got friends and you can invite them to a watch party, then please do on Facebook. If you're on YouTube and you can share the link, I'd ask you to do so because we rely on you. Our great supporters out there, the people who watch this program every Saturday morning, they've been the bedrock of which we've been able to get our information out there. And so I say good morning and thank you to you all. Loyal listeners and watchers that you are, and we are delighted to receive your support. So do share, do let people know that we are going live this morning. Yeah, it's rather grey day today in London, so it's overcast, although we're bringing some sunshine into your life this morning, I hope. First of all, I'd just, on a more serious note, really like to offer my profound and sincere condolences to the family of Serena Nolte Coombs. For those of you who don't know Serena Nolte, she works with me and as a senator at Code 7 in some work that we do in Lambeth. She's also part of the We Rock family, All Boys Rock and All Girls Rock. And I'd like to offer our condolences to Serena and her family. Her mother was a dear friend to my family, and as well as being Serena's mum and a grandmother. I'd like to just say to both Serena and her husband, Mikey, children and grandchildren who would all be shocked at this sudden death at a difficult time, our profound love and condolences. Another important message is for those who know Beanie Brown. Beanie Brown is an iconic figure in the Black community based in Birmingham, but he's known nationally across the country. And as you know, he's a fierce Pan-Africanist. He was very focused on economic self-determination and independence, and was one of the first Black organisations in the UK to purchase and secure their own property. Beanie has had a stroke, as many of you will know. But the family have asked that, although they are enormously grateful for the overwhelming messages of love and affection that people are sending them, the constant phone calls to family and to Beanie himself, who is, although had a stroke, is in recovery, is now proving to be a little bit draining. And so they're asking, and have asked me to relay the message to you, that if you could please just provide them with some time for healing and respite care, they deeply appreciate it. We send our salute to Beanie Brown and hope that he makes a fantastic and a speedy recovery. Again, if you can share the response to and let people know we're online and we're ready to go. Well, this morning's drive time looks at white responsibility for racism in the United Kingdom. In the aftermath of the murder of the African-American George Floyd, we've seen the largest global mobilization of humanity in the name of anti-racism. In nations and cities across the world, millions have taken to the streets, and taken their knees and raised their fists, demanding that the pandemic of racism, a virus I add we can control, should be eliminated. And in response, governments, global multinational companies, businesses, and the public sector all have rushed to put out public statements declaring their commitment to anti-racism and the commitment to eradicate discrimination. Everybody from Coca-Cola, BBC, Adidas, banks, universities, the Premier League itself have all declared their commitment to the anti-racist call. You may have seen the hashtag #ThisYou being posed, and this was born in response to these statements of commitment to anti-racism by the multinational and public sector organizations, was often accompanied by pictures of all white executive teams and images of racial stereotyping in advertisements, and usually statements from black employees working within these institutions who say they see no evidence of this commitment to equality exemplified by these statements. And in the private sector, and to a certain extent in the public sector too, as diversity and inclusion, that's the buzzword, explodes as corporates and public sector bodies attempt to provide a refreshed diversity response for both the private and public sector. We discuss with senior white executives and black leaders what should be the ethical anti-racist response of white institutions and individuals to the challenges posed by the Black Lives Matter movement and the #ThisYou hashtag. And in addition, the COVID crisis, because that crisis itself will lead to greater racial inequality and unemployment in the United Kingdom, probably taking it to levels not previously seen since the 1980s. And this disproportionate impact of the virus on all of us, right across the country, but particularly black communities, has left us all feeling vulnerable, deeply anxious, and indeed worried for the future. As the social and economic consequences of the virus extract a heavy price from British society, placing additional burdens on communities already disproportionately suffering social and economic exclusion, these will undoubtedly be challenging times for all of us. Given these challenges and the disproportionately negative impact on black communities, what should be the ethical response and dimension of white people in leadership positions to the challenges that now face us? And what about diversity and inclusion business consultancies? They're at the table with the corporates negotiating increased budgets for this type of work. But what is their ethical accountability? Both black, white, Asian consultancies, all in the mix, to the hundreds of thousands of young people who took to the streets demanding equality and justice. Is it all just increased PR budgets with no substantive change to policy? Well, to discuss all of this and more today, I'm delighted to be joined by my guests. Now, they're all busy people, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And my first guest today is somebody I've had the pleasure of working with, and she has definitely made an impression on me. Her name is Sherry Peck, and she's the Chief Executive of the Safer London Foundation. Sherry, are you?
Morning. How are you?
I'm well.
Good.
This morning, could you tell our avid watchers who you are and where
you? Absolutely. So as you said, my name's Sherry Peck. Only ever get called Sherilyn usually when I was naughty by my dad. So I'm known as Sherry Peck, and I'm the Chief Exec at Safer London. Been there a couple of years now. Safer London was originally the grant-making arm of the Metropolitan Police. And I think even up until about a year or 2 years ago, people would say, "Oh, you're the police's charity, aren't you?" Now, I don't want to get necessarily straight away into a debate about the police, but we're not the police's charity. We're an independent charity that works with young people, children and young people and their families in every London borough, in particular around issues around exploitation and young people that are affected by violence. We don't take a criminal justice type response. For me, this is about a safeguarding issue. And I could wax quite lyrical, I think, around what I think some of the drivers for violence, etc., are, and in particular for me, the big issue, never more so now than ever, is around social injustice and inequality. So we work in every London borough, team of about 70 or 80 of us. And yeah, as I say, we'll probably pick up some more about what we do a little later.
Well, you had it straight from Sherry. Delighted she's with us today. Our next guest is Carl Wilding. Carl's the Chief Executive of NCVO, National Council of Voluntary Organisations, a huge institution that's been around for many years. Carl Wilding, thank you for joining us here on the Jasper Drive Time this morning. Give us an introduction.
Hi, Lee. Well, thanks for having me on, first of all. NCVO, we've been around for 100 years now, and we were established just after the First World War, so that when people sort of like wanted to do stuff in their communities, that we could sort of help them coordinate and support each other, and that pretty much is what we do now. So, in a nutshell, we support sort of charities and volunteering, and we support community groups as well, and we do that across England. But we're based just on the Cali Road in Islington, for those of you that know the Cali Road.
Oh, Cali Road, down in Islington, know it very well. Our next guest is Jake Ferguson from Hackney CVS, which is a huge umbrella body for charities working in, you guessed it, Hackney. And I'm delighted Jake can be with us. I think he's one of the few chief executives of a CVS in London. I don't suppose that there are many. And therefore he'll be, we are delighted to have us with us. Jake.
For your listeners, really good. I'm a bit of a novice to radio and live stuff, so if I sound a bit nervy, that's why. But yeah, a bit about us as an organisation. So we're the umbrella body for charities in Hackney, and we've got 1,500 organisations locally. So a lot of people who need support, need opportunities to speak truth to power. So we often help community groups get in front of the council and give their opinions about things that they want to see change around. I've also got a role in that I'm a trustee of NCVO, so Carl's organisation, and I'm an advisor in many ways to Sadiq Khan around serious violence. So I sit on the Violence Reduction Unit partnership board, which is a whole range of different partners. I think what I'm most proud about in terms of what I've done at my 19 years at Hackney CVS is really focused on the needs of Black communities. And we have a group of young people who hold the police to account. We have a number of older people's organisations and networks. So what we're really about is speaking truth to power and making Hackney a fairer place. I mean, for anybody who comes from Hackney, any of your listeners, they'll have seen the borough change dramatically. And it doesn't necessarily mean positive change for everyone, you know. So I'm interested in wealth distribution, power distribution. I'm really excited to get involved in today's debate. It's so important. So thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Jake. And I can testify, doing great work over there in Hackney. So delighted to have you with us. Our final guest, but last but not least, as the saying goes, is Viva Moon, somebody our watchers will know well, founder of Black Sox, futurologist, internationalist supreme, Mr. Amoon. How are you?
I'm well, actually, very reflective this morning. As you've given me a beautiful introduction, Lee. I don't think I can top that. What I would like to say is maybe a little bit about Black Sox. It's an asset-based community development organisation. What does that mean? Black Sox recognises and believes that all the resources and all the assets that it requires in order to bring about change within the African and Caribbean heritage community exists within the community already. That's its jumping off point. So we're not out there begging anything from anybody, any organisations, but we do understand the power of collaboration, the establishment and the maintenance of a broad leadership base. Too often in our community, it's been, one lone firebrand out there advocating on behalf of the community, and too often, not working in partnership with other lone firebrands in our community. So That's where Black Sox is coming from. It's UK based, but it functions globally. So it thinks globally and it acts locally. We're part of a global initiative at the moment that's working with the George Floyd legal team to ensure that over the next few weeks and months, the states, the hidden hand isn't able to effectively tarnish our beloved brother, and in so doing, increase the potential for these officers to be released or reduce the minimum or receive a minimum charge. So yeah, I'm excited to be on the show. I think it's really important for these kinds of conversations to happen. As you will know, Lee, we like to do slow, quick, slow. So when all of this stuff kicked off, we took our time to watch, analyze, and process what was taking place. And you've already touched on some of the trends that we're beginning to recognize. One of the big ones for me, I think this program's done a really good job this morning of dealing with, is getting influencers, black and white, sit down in a room, in a studio, and just have a conversation. It's not therapy for me. I mean, I'm a therapist. I've been practicing for God knows how many years. So whilst watching the death of our beloved brother did trigger me, I'm self-aware enough to channel that energy in a way that's going to be constructive for me, my family, my grandchildren who live with me, and the wider community. So, you know, I'm really excited to have a really as authentic as possible conversation with our colleagues.
And I'm your host. I apologize because last but not least, literally last but not least, is the man who's probably in one of the biggest organizations on the panel today, Change, Grow, Live. Mike Patterson is I think he's director of operations, soon to retire, but we are nevertheless delighted to have him with us. Mike, sorry for excluding you there, almost dropping you off the end, but we're so delighted to have you this morning. Introduce yourself to our watchers and listeners.
Right, thanks, Lee. Thanks, everyone. I thought you were just setting me up to follow Viv, which is always a tricky challenge. Yeah, so I'm Mike Patterson. I'm executive director of an organisation called Change, Grow, Live. We were formerly known as Crime Reduction Initiatives, or CRI, and we, over the last 21 or so years since I've been there, we've kind of grown from being quite a small Sussex-based charity working primarily within the criminal justice system to becoming probably one of the leading providers of drug treatment services for adults and young people. I think I may have retired. I may be entering a different phase of my career, depending on how things go over the next few weeks. I'm really delighted to be here. I mean, I think the stuff that we're going to touch upon around COVID, around Black Lives Matters, around George Floyd, have real visceral kind of impacts for the organisation, our staff team, and the many, many thousands of people who are either working in our frontline services or are receiving them. I think it's a really great opportunity to be here, and I'm delighted to have the invite.
Thank you very much, Michael. Delighted to have you here too. Well, we're going to kick off, and we're going to invite my colleague Viv to open up. He was. I can hear an echo. Is that me? No, good. We're good to go. Yeah. So if I can invite Viv really just to comment on some of the opening contexts that I illustrated in the opening part of the program, touching on the key themes about George Floyd, around corporate social responsibility, about what does ethical anti-racist leadership really look like? And I only say that because one of Viv's pet projects is the Glacial Project, often achieved after spending millions of pounds, that gives diversity and inclusion such a bad name. And I'm sure he'll illuminate on that more. Viv.
Yes, sir. Oh, God, I don't know where to start. I think, well, I'm going to leave BLM to one side, because I think it's gotten a lot of oxygen, and our colleagues will probably pick up on that. I think I want to start with this whole issue of what I've been observing is the corporate sector, public sector, and everybody else in between, civic society, including private sector organizations, rushing to plug the perceived gap, throwing money at it in an effort to avoid any negative fallout publicly, which is fine. You know, it's what organizations do. I developed and grew a large organization over a number of years, and those of us who have done that will know that these organizations take on a life of their own. Even if you want to be ethical, you still have to pay attention to the bottom line and the hundreds of thousands of individuals that rely on you to pay their bills and God knows whatever it is on a monthly basis. So yeah, I don't necessarily have any issues with that. I understand how they might react and feel the need to, you know, satisfy their customers, their shareholders, and everybody else in between. I think those who are working in the D&I industry, diversity and inclusion industry, also are individuals who've got to pay bills. And for many years, I felt stuck in a role that has no real credibility, privately and increasingly in public, because of the lack of a positive result that anybody's been able to achieve over the years. And so, having said that, I do feel a growing concern over the way that this massive spend in millions, and I've been approached by many organizations over the last week and a half, particularly, the extent to which this spend will detract from this very, very important issue. Short-term spend around a historic long-term issue isn't going to change anything. It's just going to put it back below the radar as the media circus moves on to another topic. And but it will remain very firmly on the radar for those who are experiencing the fallout on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sure yet what the solution is. I do, and obviously you and I have spoken about this at length, Lee. I do believe we have to speak to those individuals that are in that industry. We have to come up with some kind of shared understanding of what an ethical intervention or an ethical commissioning process looks like in regards to addressing this matter. And somehow get all these D&I individuals who are freelance, let me not deal with the ones that are actually employed in these organizations for the minute, to sign up to that. I think we're only at the very beginning of hammering something like that together. But I can see more and more traction for it as we watch social media and it's spilling over into mainstream. I coached one of our young rising stars on an article that he produced for a HR magazine recently. And interestingly, the HR magazine asked that question up front. So it clearly is something that people are watching and alive to as we speak. And then I think the other bit for me is in regards to our community and how we address this ourselves. The do for self is so important. This idea of us doing for ourselves is so critically important to us at this point. I think that we have to spend less time undergoing therapy in the glare of the public media. I've seen a lot of programs, seen a lot of stuff on social media with individuals, sharing their experiences and how they were triggered and all the rest. Really, really important stuff. I question the extent to which it enables them to move on in their lives personally and also contribute productively to our wider collective. I'm eager to see more partnership working in our community that thinks about the medium to long-term implications of what's taking place right now. I don't want us to get distracted by the smouldering yet soon to explode debate around Black Lives Matter UK. Black Lives Matter, the hashtag is what we need to focus on. It's the principle of our lives and the fact that it matters. And too often the statistics show that as far as the state and the institutions globally are concerned, our lives don't matter. We see it in Australia, we see it in Mexico, we see it in Brazil, and elsewhere in the world, you know, Black lives clearly don't matter. So yes, Lee, they're the two bits that I really wanted to pick up on that haven't really gotten a lot of oxygen in the mainstream and social media press thus far. There's a role here for us who are influencers in our community to look to us, especially the bougies amongst us. And much as I, you know, dislike the label, I have to put myself in that category, and you as well, Lee, even though you much prefer to be referred to as an activist, you're a bougie. And I think us bougies
in Manchester.
Oh, sorry, and Jake. But let's not forget Jake. He's a quintessential bougie.
Jake.
We've got to hold our peers to account now, especially those in the D&I industry, if we're to ensure that we don't miss this opportunity.
Good. Well, yes, declaring my Mancunian grassroots credentials and absolutely resisting the categorization of Black bougie. I thank you for your contribution. So we're going to move on to Sherry Lynn, as her dad used to call her, and I will now adopt in a paternalistic fashion. That's in our name but only. And really, Sherry, you do a lot of work in Black communities with Sacred London Foundation. So reflections on what you've heard so far.
Okay. I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because once you're of a certain age, you feel like perhaps you've been through some of this historically, you know, and I've lived some of this. And when diversity and inclusion used to be about putting books in schools and picking role models and having white people go out and try to talk about diversity and inclusion in a really clunky way. I think it's really important that we all understand where our different roles are in this. Obviously I come from a white community, and that's how I can speak. It's the only thing I know, despite my life experience and where I work. But that gives me a certain role to play in all of this. I think it's really important that white people actually stand up. So I don't think you can be an anti-racist just by not being racist. I think you actually have to be proactive, and I think we all have individual responsibilities around that. And historically, I think people used to think that the way to deal with this was systemic change. And now I have an instinct that actually what we need to do is change individuals. I believe I have a real responsibility to challenge and call out other white people that I see are perhaps acting in a racist way or in not an anti-racist way, and begin to make those changes step by step as an individual. I do think there's a place for what is called the sort of diversity industry, but I think that's to be led by those that are most affected. But I think the white community are the people that are creating this problem and have a huge responsibility to step up and begin to solve it. And so for me, what does that look like for each of us individually? You know, at Safer London, when I arrived at Safer London, you're right, we do a lot of work in and with the Black community. And we quite often question why that is. As I say, we work around the topics of violence and exploitation, and we sometimes wonder why we get, if you like, not a disproportionate number of referrals from certain communities. And I think there's a lot to do with referral bias there. So many people never reach the Black community. We get way too many referrals, if you like, from the Black community. And as I say, that's a whole nother issue. But when I arrived at Safer London, I think, you know, and I've said this to people, and I've probably never said it publicly, but I think what I encountered was an organisation that was dealing with its own internal racism. So we had lots of frontline workers that were Black, that were absolutely excellent, but we had a management structure that was primarily white. Because I'd done my own work around anti-racism, and I'm not positioning myself as, you know, getting this sorted or knowing exactly all the answers, but I think I had enough knowledge to be able to see that things weren't right in the organisation. When I arrived, I think in the senior management team, there was one person of colour. It's about 50% of senior managers across the organisation are people of colour. So I think that's about me doing my own personal work and then bringing it into the institution in which I worked, and beginning to make those changes. As I say, I'm old enough that, you know, many years ago I sat on some of the ACPO working groups around the Macpherson inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, etc., etc. And I'm not sure necessarily that top down is the way forward. I actually think we need to mobilise each of us as individuals. So for me, I think I've changed my narrative about how you deal with this. And I think it's about white people challenging other white people to step up to their responsibility, whilst also allowing people from the Black community to actually have a real voice in shaping what needs to happen. That doesn't really answer your question. That's a bit of a sort of a monologue from me, really. I think the other thing that I wanted to say, and hopefully we can pick it up later, is this is a really tough subject for white people to deal with. It really is. And I'm saying that, and then also caveating that with, I'm not expecting the Black community to pick up white people's angst around this. White people like myself have to acknowledge that and support the white community to step up and begin to deal with this. Because do you know what? When you begin to face up to the fact that you've benefited from white privilege, one, that very often challenges lots of people because they say, well, I'm not a racist. I've never done anything racist. And it's not about, as I say, about proactively doing anything racist. To not be a racist, you have to proactively be anti-racist. And then the second thing, of course, is there's a finite amount of resource. So whether that's money, whether that is positions of power, whatever that is, if one community has too much of it, in order for another community to get it, you've got to give up some of yours. That's the long and the short of it. So that's really challenging for white people. And we have to acknowledge that. And then the last thing that I wanted to say, and maybe, again, we can pick up on it, at Safer London, after the murder of George Floyd, we decided we'd start creating some safe spaces for Black staff just to go away and talking. We can't do that as often as we'd like to, but, you know, we are doing it, and we'll continue to do it for as long as it's needed, or as long as we can afford it, whatever comes first. And we had some really interesting debates, because Safer London has staff from very marginalised communities that actually are visibly white. So from Gypsy and Traveller communities, and we've got some people that are Australian from Aboriginal communities, and they also questioned what their role was within this debate. And we made a decision as an organisation that those safe spaces had to be about those people that were visibly Black. But there is a role as well for people that sort of straddle the two communities, where they may be from a marginalised community and understand some of that marginalisation, but also can pass using their visible white privilege. So don't know if I've answered any of your questions, Lee, but sort of said a lot that was in my head.
And we thank you for that, Sherry. I don't know if people saw the Channel 4 programme in relation to can the school change racism, and it was a group of young children in the first year of secondary school, I think, in South London. And at one section, Dr. Nicola Rollick, absolutely giving you a salute for pulling that programme together. But they had a discussion, and they began to talk about Blackness and whiteness, and they separated into distinct ethnic groups. And the comment from the commentator who was watching both groups through CCTV said the Black discussion amongst the young people was like a carnival, and the white discussion was like a funeral, because it was so angst-ridden in the way that you described, being difficult for those conversations. So I think there's some truth in that, and we're going to move swiftly on. I'm going to bring in Mike Partington, the forgotten man of Lee Jasper's Drive Time, but I wanted to bring him in. Mike, your reflections on what you've heard so far?
There's such massive issues, aren't they? So short of just saying, I agree with what she said, I need to try and say something a bit more interesting. I think that there's some great chat on the bar around the role of white people as allies in this. And I think, I am clearly a white leader of an organisation that has a predominantly white senior leadership team. And I think we have to acknowledge that. We have to have the conversation. We've done all the stuff that you mentioned almost in your introduction. We've made a very powerful statement about Black Lives Matters. We've made kind of very verbal, strong commitments. The responsibility of us is to do something about it now. It's not enough just to acknowledge the horrors. And I'm similarly of an age where George Floyd is such a kind of a focal point right now. That we don't want to lose the energy, but whether it's Cherry Gross or Cynthia Jarrett or Roger Sylvester or Mark Duggan, these names, or Sarah Reed, these names and these horrors come up continually, and we have a real responsibility, a heavy responsibility and duty, I think, probably to remember why we came into this sector in the first place. People come in to our sector, the voluntary sector, to deal with the impact that this system has on poor, marginalised people. Whether it's homeless people or drug users or people in the criminal justice system, it's a system that has marginalised and impacted on poor people. That's the point of it almost. Now, when you then are black and poor, you feel the full weight of society against you almost. So it feels to me like I had a conversation with Viv a couple of weeks ago around the kind of upsurge globally around the murder of George Floyd, and that kind of scale. How optimistic are you? Because and I'm probably more optimistic than Viv because I come from a different position of privilege and as more of an observer rather than someone who lives and feels it all the time. But my kind of sense of optimism comes from just the upsurge in young people who are just seeing the way that the current system treats almost young people with contempt, most of us with contempt, and can see the impact in terms of murder and killing of people. And it just feels to me like that there's such a groundswell that we have an opportunity to make this become a moment of change. So it's fascinating. So what are we trying to do internally as an organisation? I mean, I'm very. I can just hear Sherry's comments around some conversation in her own organisation about, why angst, what do we do? And people say, I'm scared of saying the wrong thing. The kind of position we're trying to take is, well, actually saying nothing is always the wrong thing. Saying something, doing something, making changes, making real changes. So, building on, where's the black talent coming through the organisation? How do we get people from heads of services roles into director roles? How do we get people? Someone's just said on the chat, step aside. I'm not going to pretend that's the only reason I'm stepping aside and leaving the organisation. But all the time you've got a very small, stable, long-serving management team. Those spaces don't open. So we're going through a period of change as an organisation where we've relaunched a strategy that's been on hold because of COVID. There are opportunities for us now that we have to show that visible leadership as an organisation, and I think personally and on individual levels we have to show integrity and show that leadership because as Sherry said, anti-racism has to be active. It's not enough to be passively angst-ridden. You have to make personal decisions, take action, and be positive to make any chance of having any change.
Thank you for that, Mike. Another ringing testimony, really, in relation to active anti-racism. Moving on to the wild man of the bunch, Mr. Carl Wilding from MTVO, and your reflections, Carl, on what you've heard thus far.
So I think I'll start by saying that all of this conversation resonates, and one of the sort of the challenges that has been made to me at work is that even sort of like by taking part in a conversation today, as a white man and sort of talking about this, by centering myself to sort of use the expression that I'm doing the wrong thing by not having my colleagues sort of here instead of me, because I think everything that we have learned in recent months as an organisation has come from our black and minority ethnic colleagues who are very much leading the organisation through a conversation about these issues. I'll then say that some of the stuff that that we've talked about so far in terms of, let's call it the charity sector, because that's the easiest language. Some of this stuff, there's clear evidence that we've got a problem. I think 92% of charity trustees are white. So clearly, the people who are leading our sector don't reflect the population at large, and especially when you consider that so many organisations are based in London and the south and the big cities. That's clearly a problem. Just to sort of, by way of an example, I think the figure is that 1 in 12 charity trustees are called John or David. So I guess the thing that I'm sort of trying to say is that I think as these conversations have sort of developed, not just since George Floyd, but they started sort of developing in earnest last summer, when some of the people watching or listening to this might be aware that a charity had some training materials that were found to be racist. And then in response to that, a campaign was set up called Charity So White, and to highlight issues about structural racism in the sector, and that's grown and grown, I think, over the sort of the last year. So this is a discussion that increasingly we're having in the sector, and everything that everyone has talked about so far about, let's call it white fragility, this sort of stuff is writ large, and we're finding it difficult, I think, to have these conversations. And to give you a sort of an insight into some of the difficulty, I think some of it is about people like me, who I think thought we were doing the right thing, and we weren't, and that's quite difficult to admit to yourself that you're doing things that are wrong. Some of it is about the nature of the action that you take, and social media is sort of not helping with sort of this stuff, in that there's an awful lot of it strikes me as sort of not just campaigning, but some of the statements that they've referred to at the beginning, that not just charities make, but public bodies and corporates make. But to use sort of the phrase I've heard, it's very performative. It's very good at sort of showing in public that you care about this stuff, but it's then not actually sort of backed up by action. But then I find myself in sort of conversations that are about, well, what do you mean by action? Because there are actions that you can take that are sort of short term, and they sort of they do actually change things. But then I come across this expression about the deep work. So in other words, the sort of the real cultural change that your organizations have to make to not just be anti-racist, but also to be, I don't know what the word is here, anti-disablist. I don't know. The point that I guess I'm sort of trying to make here is that we're talking about race today and racism, but for charities, it's not just about racism. It's also about whether or not we are a place that is welcoming to people, to disabled people, to LGBTQ people, to working class people. Actually, I mean, that class is one of the unspoken issues that sort of crosses over or intersects with sort of stuff about sort of colour. So how do you get the balance right between doing sort of tangible things that are sort of quick actions and sort of longer term sort of stuff? And then finally, as NCVO, I guess one of the sort of the things that we're thinking about is that there are people on the call, again, like Viv or Jake, in fact, everyone who has spoken so far, in some respects, are further ahead of us. And how do we, I think where we can play a role and what we've got to think about is how do we bring together all the sort of the people that really have thought about this and actually have found ways forward that work, that have found solutions, and how do we get better at sort of sharing some of that stuff? Because it's really interesting sort of hearing, was it Lee, you said before about the difference between a carnival and a wake? I mean, I'd love to be in a place where these were really positive, forward-looking discussions about the change that we can make, and we can't get to that point until we've had the difficult discussions about sort of where we are sort of just now. I've got probably more to say, but I'll stop there, Lee.
Carl, thank you very much. And not wanting to interrupt the discussion at all, because I think we've got a real flow going. I'm going now to our final contributor in the panel discussion, Jake Ferguson. Jake, reflections on what you've heard thus far?
Thanks, Lee. I think it's fair to say probably everything I would have said has been said, and I really appreciate the honesty and candor of my fellow guests. So I'm not really going to be able to top them. What I'm interested in, Lee, is I've spent 19 years in and out of council boardrooms and the dynamics of that, and seen there has in the last 5 years been certainly in my experience in Hackney, a shift in the dynamics in that room. And I think the whole George Floyd, Black Lives Matter and COVID episodes have really brought that to the fore and really sort of put a bit of pressure on those dynamics, because we know that a lot of this debate is ultimately about power and values from my perspective. Who has the power? What values are we looking at the world? What values lens are we looking through? And clearly, as Viv articulated earlier, black people are just not valued across the world. And that plays out in the boardroom, it plays out on the street, it plays out in people's homes, it plays out in all parts of society. I think when we do our work, what we're trying to do is to bring the voices of communities and community organizations, those that work in them, close to those who effectively have power or think they have power within local authorities and the NHS. And those conversations often start with the council presenting its strategy and everyone else being expected to go along with it. And then there's usually about 5-10 minutes at the end for the community to say its piece. And clearly the dynamics there are all wrong. The people in the community who are suffering the issues don't have the power to be able to make the convincing arguments. I'm also really interested in the architecture of oppression. I mean, it's very blatant in this country. We have a police force that doesn't value black people like they value others. We've had a recent incident in Hackney where 2 robbery officers arrested a young black lad, took him off his BMX, cuffed him face down and had their knee on his neck, literally a few weeks ago. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is George Floyd all over again. What's going through that police officer's mind to think that he can treat a young person of African heritage like a piece of meat? I mean, I don't want to create trauma for any of our listeners, but we know this is real in the black community. And I think it shows that their values system as a police force is completely broken. And that's, for me, where we need to really get into the heart of the issues. I'm also interested in the architecture of oppression when we look at money and how money flows in the public sector and then to the charity sector. So Carl will know this. There is a huge economic inequality in charities, in that the biggest charities have all the money and the local charities, the small grassroots ones, are lucky if they operate on anything more than 20 or 30k a year. But they're often closest to the issues and agile and able to be responsive to things as they emerge. So we've got to really look at that. We've also got to look at the fact that we're becoming a bit like America, in that we set up these systems like the gangs matrix, like youth offending systems that, I mean, I'll give you an example. So in Hackney, I think they spend about 1.6, 1.8 million on youth justice, so children 16 to 18. And it's actually only about 100 kids that benefit from this. But if you do the sums, you could actually give each child 16,000, 17,000 pounds a year. You could give them a job rather than us all chasing them around and checking where they are and making sure they're doing this, that, and the other. We could actually employ them. And I don't understand that. We've got this perverse system in this country of where we spend our money. And in America, obviously, the prison system has become this huge corporate global business that basically needs black people to be incarcerated in order for the business to work. So I'm always interested in looking at the economics of things, because if we don't, we're in danger of just having a discussion, a very important discussion about values, but without looking at the machinery that feeds those values, or the values feed that machinery. So I'm really interested in this debate that's happening in the States and increasingly over here about, you know, should we defund the police? If the police cannot serve each of its customers equally and do a good job and be public servants as opposed to a police force, then we as taxpayers should have the right to say, you're not doing a good job, mate, so we're going to take some of that money back. So it might sound radical, but I think actually it's the only way people are going to actually listen. And we really, let's get under the surface of some of the important debates about values and how we respect each other, and let's look at the architecture of oppression. I'll stop there, Lee, because I'll probably start ranting.
No, that's my job. Thank you very much. But thank you for that contribution, and thank you all for that. I think there's some really interesting points there that are worthy of greater reflection. One is this issue of white anxiety, which is paralyzing any real action to any degree. And not only do I hear it, but you can almost feel it in the discussion. Which is remarkable, given that you're all a million miles away from where I'm sitting. Secondly, there's the issue of the corporate social responsibility in relation to equalities. We talked about economics, and I think that's absolutely key. Jay makes a most excellent point. You know, some of the biggest brands in the world who are putting out these statements and who have comments back from their black workers groups about the apparent hypocrisy of those statements have the biggest, you know, huge black customer databases. I think the other issue for me is the interesting dynamic that was mentioned by Mike and Viv and others. And so rather than waffle on, let me ask the panel to, given you've heard what everybody's had to say about some of the challenges here, anybody can jump in relation to giving us additional comment. Who's going to be first?
I'm happy to pick up on a couple of things, and that people have said. The first thing is that I personally struggle with this notion that if people are in marginalised communities, we also attach the label vulnerable to them. I think they're made vulnerable by the context in which they live in, but actually very often many of the people that I've worked with throughout the years are the most resilient, strongest, hardworking people. So I think we have to be really careful about language and labeling people. That's the first thing. I think I also and again, maybe this is me getting a bit jaded and a bit old. People talked about being optimistic, and I think it links the notion of being optimistic because young people are involved now and there's a lot of noise around perhaps making some change, and the points that Jake talked about the whole sort of structural inequality. Actually, my fear is that post-COVID, when things are going to be even more, there's going to be greater austerity, there's going to be even less money in the system. I'm already seeing the very large, and Carl might have an opinion on this, you know, the very, very large charities gobbling up money, even less trickling down to those organisations at grassroots who are the people that can really, really make a difference. I actually am probably less optimistic that the people with power are going to release any of those resources down to communities, whomever those communities are. For me, I think, and I'm getting towards retirement now, this is going to be one of the toughest periods of my career to try to get money into communities that support the Black community or young Londoners that are in need of support. So I'm not very optimistic. I don't ever want to be part of anything that labels these communities vulnerable. They're not. They might be marginalised, but they're not vulnerable. They're very resourceful. Even when we talk about children and young people that are involved in county lines, you know, I've got this notion that if you push people to the margins, that's where they then have to operate. But many of the young people that I work with are very highly intelligent. If they were able to get a job, could thrive in that job. But we've created a context where people can't thrive. There's no opportunity, there's no affordable housing, there's no jobs that will pay a living wage. And actually, far too many young people from the Black community are then labelled because they've been involved in something like the gangs matrix or what have you, then they can't move into employment. So there's a lot there again, but I felt like these are not vulnerable people. They are people that are being pushed to the margins by a system that's trying to hold on to power.
Make some excellent points there. Going forward, anybody else?
Should I?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I think I agree with almost everything that Sherry said. Again, I think that the challenge that's going to face, if I just talk from a voluntary sector perspective at the moment, the challenge that is going to face us as whatever happens to government spending after this pandemic, it's not going to be good. And we know that the money is going to get sucked out of civic society and local communities, and therefore the groups and organisations that are most at risk of that are going to be the smaller community groups. I think it's incumbent on large providers to be mindful of that. I think we mustn't play into the game that the government and local authorities will say that we spend X number of hundreds of thousands of pounds on the voluntary sector. It's all great. We as an organisation are funded to do very specific things within a budget. If we start to creep out of that at the expense of local organisations, that's the very opposite of ethical leadership. So I think how we can play a role in nurturing and supporting smaller community groups or smaller organisations, how we take services to them rather than trying to pretend that we can do stuff that we couldn't. I think it's really incumbent on large organisations to park that mentality, to be focused on what they're good at, to be humble about what they're not good at, and certainly to ditch the stuff about income protection. I think when I've seen some large players in the charity sector almost pleading for extra money at the moment, rather than looking at their bank balances and their reserves at a time when people are dying because of government policy, I think it's the most distasteful thing I've seen in recent months.
Thank you for that, Mike. Powerful commentary. Definitely, the conversation is getting up. Mike, Carl, you're indicating you're a chair of NCVO. You've heard very lots there about the architectural inequality of the charitable sector, and sometimes the extent to which big charitable organisations are content to sign off government policy even when that mitigates against the sector itself. What say you, sir?
I want to talk about the funding thing first of all, and sort of come back to points that Mike and Sherry have made. In my sort of intro before, I talked about how 9 out of 10 trustees are white. And one of the problems that we've got in the sector is that some of the organisations that are best in control of the resources in the sector, for example, in trusts and foundations that provide grants to the sector, they're run by people that don't have lived experience of the communities that we're talking about. So there are some practical things that we've got to do to change the architecture that Jake talked about. So one of them is that we need better better representation on the boards and in the senior leadership of those organisations, and indeed I include my own organisation in that. And we're trying to do something about that, and change is happening, but it's not happening quickly enough, and it's not happening widely enough. Then we've got to think specifically about the fact that if you want strong communities, you need strong organisations amongst those communities. And at the moment, the way that we fund those organisations, it drains their capacity rather than adds to them. So we've got to change the way that we fund those organisations. And we have literally got to get more money into those organisations. And one of the things that I hope will be a positive about the COVID crisis is that it has shone a light onto sort of the fragility of especially organisations for Black and minority ethnic communities. It's shone a light onto their financial fragility, but what it's also done is that it's set off a discussion amongst funders that for want of a better expression, Lee, we tend to put the problem at their door. We always say, oh, well, those organisations, they don't have capacity. It's their fault. They're not very good at filling in grant applications, and it's their problem. And actually, it's leading to a discussion now that actually, no, that's rubbish. We are the problem. And we've got to change our behaviours and our practices because that is what is stopping money flowing to those organisations. So one of the good things about the COVID crisis is that it's sort of it's instigated that discussion. But also, I want to build on things that that other people have, I think, said this morning, and that is, people like me, we've got to stop doing stuff to other people, whether that's people who are different from us because of their ethnicity or because they're disabled or women or whatever, and we've got to put more power into their hands. So Jake and I and others are having conversations about, well, can we set up grant-making foundations, or can we strengthen existing grant-making foundations that are led and controlled by Black and minority ethnic communities? Because ultimately, I mean, it's not just money is power, but information is power. And if we strengthen the institutions of those communities so that they don't just have money, but they have relationships, they can link into other organizations of power, that ultimately is going to strengthen the communities I think that we all care about on this call.
Thank you very much, Mike. We're motoring along wickedly. Viv, so far, what?
Yeah, I'm practicing something I don't practice often enough. I'm keeping my mouth shut and my ears open to really, ingest what I'm hearing. A couple of things come up, and I'm also watching what people are saying in the chat room. I think the first thing for me is the extent, because we're all very good at articulating the issues in here. We're all experienced, we've got decades under our belt in regards to negotiating difficult issues like this, navigating difficult issues like this. I really think it comes down to practice. I don't think any of us has been radical enough at the moment, and I include myself. I know that organizations there's some better than others. I think the leadership has to do more, has to take personal responsibility for the organizations that they drive and the privilege that they benefit from. I am privileged as an individual, as somebody who operates as a consultant. When I came back into the UK on just before lockdown, COVID-19, it did not adversely impact me financially. I have to accept that. I have to accept that my grandchildren are, really, for the most part, unaware of the challenges that Black children like them are experiencing. And this is why I talk about the importance of bougies in our community doing what needs to be done when they're in these rooms of privilege, because there are many Black individuals wandering around the corridors of power. Our friend Patricia Lamore describes them as Black people in high places talking very, very, very quietly in dark corridors. We need them to be out there pushing on behalf of the community that ultimately, at the end of the day, enable them to get into those key places of influence. When we talk about ethical leadership, we're talking about personal accountability first, and then holding your peers to account and the institutions that you may be connected to account as well. And this goes back to the point that Sherilyn made about systemic change vis-a-vis individual change. I don't think it's either or, I think it's both. There's no way we can get the shift that we say we're wanting to see without dealing with the structure. It's sheep dipped in dysfunctionality and inequality. So there are fundamental policies, procedures, and practices that go back hundreds of years that need to be dismantled, destroyed, and rebuilt. And it falls to us, those of us in key places, to be, if it needs to be the case, the lone voice speaking out in response to the injustice that's everywhere. And it's, you know, I'm sitting in here listening to a conversation that to an extent is colloquial, really, but this is a global issue and we're in the midst of a catastrophe. You know, people are literally dying in their thousands, if not their millions, because of this global injustice that we see play out. The George Floyd aspect of it that's triggered what we've witnessed in the conceptual West, you know, we're alive to and we're sensitive to, because social media and the internet has played it that way, and the platforms for the most part are American platforms. So that's why so many of our young people and other people in the community are more aware of George Floyd than some of the other individuals that have died, you know, in London and just up the road from many of them. So as I'm listening, I'm thinking, yes, but what more can we do personally? You know, are we speaking out enough as individuals who are privileged? Is the shift that's taking place in our organizations radical enough? Let me own it for myself. So I could come on here and talk about what, you know, the state isn't doing, and, you know, what, you know, why people are not doing and all the rest of it. But I know there's some serious dysfunction taking place in my own community. I don't want I don't want a knee jerk from the organizations that are struggling to do better to result in money going to Black individuals and Black-led organizations who I know are not ethical in how they go about doing what needs to be done. I did a piece of work for the Home Office just on the back of the disturbances in 2011. It took about 4 years. It was a difficult piece of work, and negotiating how it would play out and the recommendations I made would play out. We agreed that I would get paid no matter what happened with the report. We agreed that if we didn't both agree on the content of the report wouldn't be published, but I would be able to speak about it as I saw fit. The report was never published because we couldn't agree on the content. And this is the fundamental point that I'm talking about. We couldn't agree on the content because they didn't want fundamental truths to be widely circulated with the Home Office brand on it. But what came out of that for me, just talking to communities up and down the country, is the disappointment that we have with individuals in our community that present themselves as leaders but don't operate as ethical leaders. You know, on the back of this, many individuals who happen to be, as one a senior person described, squeaky wheels will get the money, but they're not the individuals who most deserve the money and are most likely to use that money in the most appropriate and ethical way. So this is a very complex issue that we need to manage very sensitively, not least because we're talking about an economic downturn that's probably going to make 2008 look like a walk in the park. They're talking about an economic contraction or downturn that's worse in 3 centuries. We know that it's us, our communities, that are going to catch, you know, the most extreme hell out of it. So I think we're all saying the right things because we can and we know how to, but it's only action that's going to make the difference. And Carl talked about class, and I completely agree with him, which is why I talked about the bourgeois and the proles. There are many in our community, Black individuals, that have been elevated, and usually elevated because they're ones who are least likely to speak out about what they see when they get into these privileged spaces. We need to hold those people to account as much as we hold ourselves to account going forwards.
Well, again, the conversation is never dull when we begin to excavate these issues on racism and discrimination. Who wants to come in? Don't be shy, just jump in.
I want to go back, Viv, to qualify my point about the fact that, you know, things can come top down or they can come bottom up. Yeah, and I think if we look at the police are only representative of society, right? And so we cannot label everybody with the same brush. I remember many moons ago being at a conference and hearing Leroy Logan, who I think at the time was the chair of Black Police Association, talk about the fact that even Black police officers were hampered by institutional racism. So I completely agree with you that I think we have to deal with this structurally. But I think for me, what people from the white community have to do is their own work on themselves individually. And I guess that was the point that I was trying to make, that yes, we shouldn't just say, oh, well, let's ignore the structures that are creating inequality. But what I am saying is that I did my bit, you know, historically, I did I rolled out nationally a load of training for white mothers of mixed race children and trained social workers back in the day that when you gave birth to a mixed race child, if they had a blue spot on their back, all of a sudden you had child services investigating you because social workers didn't understand that simple stuff. So I did all of that. Let me see if I can change the system from the top down. And in fact, some of that lands and some of it doesn't, yeah, because as I say, I do believe there is this real resistance to giving stuff up, because this isn't, as I say, about buying a few books or perhaps understanding how the language you should use, etc., etc., etc. It is about changing what society looks like and giving stuff up, you know, whether that's resource, money, etc., etc. And that's a real tough ask to say, do you know what, as a white person, in order to make sure that equality and diversity really happens, you're going to have to give some of your power up, some of your money up, some of your resources up. And people are reluctant to do that. So as I say, I think it has to come both ways, but I just wanted to qualify that really. I'm not anti the structural stuff. I just think we need to do our own work as white people.
I think you're right. That's why I said it's a combination of the two. You know, in emotive conversations like this, people tend to be binary because the emotion is driving it. You know, why do you always do that? That's just something I've had from personal relationships many times in the past, and you push back on that and say, well, no, not all the time, X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. So it's that more measured, nuanced approach that will be required, and it doesn't happen in the first heat of a really tragic situation like the death of George Floyd over 8 minutes and 45 seconds broadcast everywhere. But as some people are saying in the chat room, you know, it does start with the self first. You know, I'm saying I've got to look to myself and look at what I'm doing. And when I'm sitting around individuals and witness to individuals like Trevor Phillips is happy to throw his community under the train in order to get personal gain, I'm saying we need to hold those individuals to account. You know, Black Socks it says we've got to do for self first, and that does mean holding ourselves to account. Jake, being the modest man that he is, hasn't referred to the Black Men for Change organization, which he launched last year. 56 influential Black men in their leading organizations in the commercial sector and otherwise. It's evolving. But one of the first things that it did was initiated ethical leadership programs in 4 key boroughs: Waltham Forest, Haringey, Hackney, and Brixton. And it actively building on developing that, because, you know, the fundamental and structural change, not just in the institutions, we've got to look at what, you know, we need to change within our own communities as we move forward, so that we get the kind of leaders that we want. I think it's Tete said in the group, you know, the system picks the leaders from our community that they think will be most malleable. And we need to try our level best as we move forward. So if we're to get anything out of this situation, to ensure that it's the leaders that we want that get elevated and not the leaders that the state wants. You know, this accountability thing, we've got to be radical about it. You know, I want Carl to be a radical ethical leader within NCBO. I want him to be so edgy and so radical that he feels the heat from his board. That's what I want. I want him to feel the heat from other, you know, white male John leaders who don't want to go that far, and saying, you know, at the end of the day, you know, we're unhappy with Carl because he's become a race traitor. You know, he's going against the collective grain. That's what I'm looking for. I don't come on programs like this to say stuff that's going to get, you know, the props from the black community at the end of the day. That's why I place the emphasis on us and say, hold on a minute, there are black individuals out there who are not doing what needs to be done. We need to draw them up first. Because if we don't, it won't matter what the state or institution does, we'll continually be undermining ourselves. That's it. And the last point is in regards to our young people. They're fed up. They've got no respect for us. Now, we weren't out on the front line because of COVID-19. That's fair enough. But now the state is looking for shift. They're going to call in the likes of me and Lee and others and Jake into the room. We've got to make sure that we're transparent, so we share what's been discussed in those rooms, in those dark corridors. And we've got to make sure that we speak on behalf of the community, not communicate what we feel is most appropriate because we think we know better, because we're somehow higher up the economic and intellectual tree. That's the fundamental point I'm making. And it's not tidy, it's not comfortable, it's highly dysfunctional at the end of the day on a personal level. Now, if you're comfortable, Mike, Sherry Lynn, Carl, Jake, Viv, Lee, then clearly we're not doing enough. That's the fundamental point I'm making.
Can I come in on that, Viv? And I think you're absolutely spot on. I think we can actually, coming back to my point earlier about the dynamism of those conversations that need to have, usually we're expected to go into a government type room and operate and do our thing, aren't we? You know, and there's usually a chair, and we know usually where we are in the pecking order, whether we're black or white. I think I'm always interested in changing the whole fundamentals of that conversation from the outset, because if you walk into a room like that, you're already powerless to a certain extent. So what we've always tried to do is to say, get those leaders, get those power brokers into a room with us where we can set the dynamics of the room, where young people are in control. And I think as leaders, as people in the system, we should be taking young people to our meetings with us and letting them share the space, share the mic with us, share that, so they can see the power dynamic and how it plays out, and learn on the job almost. And I think we've got some fantastic young people coming through now, whether that's through the BLM movement or they've been doing other stuff, that they have ideas well in advance of us. We've got the baggage of the systems thinking, and we're trying to wrestle with that, and this conversation is a reflection of that. But actually, they're coming at this with a different set of perspectives, different level of experience, and I think I'm really excited about some of the young talent coming through. We've got, you know, after the riots back in disturbances back in 2011, that was at a point in Hackney when there were something like 1,200 stop and searches every month. You know, despicable child abuse, frankly, going on in terms of how the police were patrolling the area and picking on black kids predominantly. So we thought, well, let's shift the power structure, and we created a young people stop and search monitoring group. It's now called Account. If anybody's interested, check out their work. Brilliant. Young people, far more eloquent than us, right on the money. And if I get a chance to talk to a top policeman, I don't want to talk on behalf of young people. I'd rather young people in the room. So I use my position to literally lie down and let the young people walk over me. I should be the one lying down over the puddle, not expecting them to wade through it. So I think we can go much further than within this notion of ethical leadership. It literally is sharing the power and sharing our opportunities to influence with those that are most impacted. And I think we can do some really clever stuff, interesting stuff in this space. The other, coming back to how some of those in power, when it comes to race, the amount of times that white leadership has said to me, well, I'm not black, Jake, so how can I talk about the issues? I mean, I've had, borough commanders say that to me, and it's like, what? I don't get it. Why? What's this about? So I think some people need to be helped. I think some people need to be nudged. Others need to be removed. But I do think let's in the media, and particularly this conversation has been fantastic, that we've heard such positivity coming from Sherry, Mike, and Carl as white members of this conversation. We should be celebrating the fact that they are having these conversations. Let's let them be the leaders for other white people. Let them be the ones who can show the way that things can be done differently. Whilst Viv and I are the ones that really need to be answering to our community and able to say, we feel your pain, but we want you in the room with us to share that and to help us co-produce the solutions. If we don't, we're probably just going to do a bit more. We're just going to do what Trevor Phillips has always done, but not necessarily with his intent, but it will be the end result is that we will be the eloquent black people in the room that they like to have a convo with, rather than actually focusing on what we're actually trying to say. So I think we can go much further. I'm all for radicalism, and I think we can't be beating around the bush here. We haven't got much time. As we know, economic roller coaster is about to hit us, and it's starting to hit us. And if we don't get busy in this space, we are going to be, I'm going to say an expletive then, but we're going to be in deep trouble. Let's say that. And, you know, I thank people like you, Lee, for just making the space for honesty. I think the more that we do that, the closer we get to the nub of it.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to come to you, Carl, and then to you, Mike. It seems to me, if I may add to the conversation, not abusing my position as host, but what actually required is a paradigm shift in approach to these issues. That's what I see coming out of young people out there on the streets in their thousands and people across the world in their millions. They're asking for a profound paradigm shift from a 20th century approach to these issues to a much more educated, informed, and dare I say, emotionally intelligent, speaking to Sherry's point, emotionally intelligent response from those in power and positions of responsibility. Carl?
It's really interesting listening to Viv and Jake and looking at some of the comments in the chat. I'm going to be pessimistic and then I'm going to be optimistic. So the pessimism is that I share Viv's desire for change, but I guess my pessimism is that when I just think about charities in sort of my bit of the world, we've been around for 400 years and we're trying to change 400 years worth of practice and ways of doing things and culture and attitudes in what feels like 400 days or less. And I mean, that's hard. So then I sort of come to sort of what Jake says about, I mean, how do we move people along the spectrum and sort of where they are? And I guess sometimes where I feel a bit frustrated with some of these conversations is that I'm not quite sure that we've articulated what our theory of change is, about how do we get people to move along the spectrum from where they are, let's say, to being racist or being colorblind to being effectively anti-racist. And sometimes I think our only theory of change is to embarrass people or to sort of shock them. And I think we need to think a bit more about what the theory of change is, because from my experience, and again, you know, I mean, maybe I'm talking to the wrong people. I do actually think people give us stuff. They do want to change things, but they're feeling really awkward about sort of how to do it. My last bit of negativity is that we talk a lot about what we want government to do. And I guess sometimes I think, certainly in our sector as charities, I think we spend far too much time talking about the government needs to do X and the government needs to do Y. And sometimes those conversations, they feel like an excuse for not changing ourselves and for not doing things ourselves. And I think we've got much more power ourselves and the ability to change things than we will admit to. And I think so we've got to turn the conversation sort of onto us. So my positive bit, Lee, is that one of the things that has happened, I think, over the last decade is that, you know, in social media and the internet, it's completely changed how power works in my sector. And 10 years ago, the conversation would have been essentially, well, we're in control as big charities or even small charities, and really what we've got to do is that we've got to basically just work out how can we tell people what to do about how to support us and what we want to do. What all this stuff has changed, it's turned it around, and we are trying to keep up with what people on the ground want a lot of the time now, because we can't control what they're saying about our causes and sort of stuff like that. So where I'm optimistic is that I think digital and social media has empowered people more than we ever did. So the challenge now is about what are the rules and the techniques and whatever, so that we can support people in what we want to do. And I think that mindset is slowly changing. And my optimism, if no one's come across it, it's this book. It's called New Power: How It's Changing in the 21st Century and Why You Need to Know. And it talks about the fact that the future of our sector, it's about being transparent, as someone has said in the chat. It's about recognizing that people on the ground are in control, and what we've got to do is try and work out how best that we can support them, because as Jake and others have said, they're the people with the good ideas. They're the people who know where the need is greatest. They're the people who know where the state is being overweening and overpowering. And what our job is to do is what Jake said, it's to stop trying to speak for them. And instead now we've got to change our model so that we are saying, we'll open the door for you, and then we're going to put you at the front because you are the authentic people who really know what's going on.
A good point. And I think it was somebody very famous, Lenin, I think, who said there are times in periods of history where you have very little change over decades, and then you have weeks in history where you get decades of change in literally weeks. And I think that's where we are. We've seen more movement over in the aftermath of George Floyd's death from very many individuals that we hadn't seen in decades previously. Mike.
Everyone's being muted. I think I just wanted to say, I mean, when Viv asked the question, you want to feel discomfort. I think, I mean, anyone in a leadership position, a white leader at the moment who feels comfortable really hasn't been paying attention at all, have they? I think but that's not enough. It's what we can do with whatever power we've got in whatever institutions we are to actually try and do something to affect real change. And there's something about mindset. There's something about knowing your own place, and there's a kind of temptation in leadership roles or senior roles or larger organisations to try and be the expert on everything rather than creating the conditions that allow expert voices to be heard and amplified. So, we know quite a lot about how effectively to treat opiate users, heroin users. We don't know much else about, community-led activism, but we can create a platform through which those voices are heard. We can be less worried about, the political ramifications of people using our organisation as a platform for their voices to be heard. And I think that's the real commitment. We have to speak up. We have to speak out. We have to take the notion of what being an ally really means. So in many conversations I've had recently, there's kind of people being worried about saying the wrong thing or worried about creating the conditions where things might be controversial, because it always seems to be about control. And the thing about being an ally is the first thing you can do is just shut up and listen, and then think about what people have been said, and then think about how those voices can be heard, rather than trying to sanitize it and whitewash it into something that you think might be acceptable. And that's the kind of commitment I think that as ethical leaders that we have to hold ourselves to, and we have to be held to account for.
I think that's absolutely right. To Carl's point, I think that the issue is that what I would say is that racism and the lived experience of racism traumatizes Black people too. And so when it traumatizes us and we are left in that powerless state, of suffering those microaggressions and sometimes major aggressions of indignity. The few opportunities we do get to speak about these issues will often open a door to that trauma, and therefore the articulation can be difficult for people to experience and listen to. But what I've always found in relation to those white leaders who do make a difference is those who can endure that emotional backblast, if you like, that is a result of the legacy of trauma in people's lives and the denial of justice, are the ones that really come through the other end and begin to have proper constructive conversations with people who then, once they've understood that, because you're not the same as everybody else. There's no black people are exhausted with white people saying, yeah, we're committed, we want to do something, and then nothing happening. And so I would say that, part of the learning curve is to just understand that historical trauma that individuals will face. But just my 2 pennies, look, we believe in Black Sox that accountability starts at home. And the first accountability for us is in our own community. So we speak to our ethical leadership responsibilities within our own community. And we say to our community, you can't rely on the state to solve your problem. There is no hand check from the Home Office that is going to aid your liberation. Yes, as taxpayers, we should be accessing support and necessary, but that shouldn't be at the expense of doing that which can be done with the resources that we do have available to tackle these sorts of things. So I just thought I'd make that intervention. I shan't abuse it further as we're coming to 11:30. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah.
Discussion. Sherry and then Jake.
Sort of picking up on that, but also picking up some of the live comments that have come up. And somebody talked about, why do we need to teach people? So why do we need to teach white people about this? I think that, again, is something that we have to verbalise as white people in this arena, in that many of us struggle in this debate, but we shouldn't therefore be putting that onto the Black community. We shouldn't be compounding that trauma. I think we have to really understand that this is work that we have to do, and then not somehow put that on our Black colleagues and our Black friends. Somebody else in the chat also talked about fear. And I do think one of the greatest things for me has been that I have got some very, very good, close female Black friends. And, sometimes when you need to think through something about your approach to something, whether it's, even for me, sometimes if I want to write an email to staff, when I've blogged something, when I've written something, I will use those people that I know can be really close, critical allies and say, actually, that's landed this way with me, that's landed that way with me. So I understand that fear, but it's our responsibility to find people that can support our learning without us compounding the trauma in the Black community.
Good point, Jake.
I'm going to slightly shift the conversation a little bit, Lee, or return to a former discussion about assets and what assets we need as different communities to succeed in life. And given I talked earlier about the sort of architecture of oppression, I think what we have done, and Lee, you will remember this from the days of old, when communities were given buildings, assets, from which to flourish from. And we know about how institutional racism means that a lot of our tax-paying money goes into the fine arts and a certain sort of fine art that serves a certain community, white community, generally speaking. And I think government, I know we're trying to avoid looking at government responsibility, but I often think when times are tough like this, now is the time when we should be giving long-term assets to particularly Black communities so that they can thrive and do for self, as Viv has pointed out. we had a really interesting conversation in Hackney yesterday. Two, in fact. One was about the council's commitment to renaming certain streets and buildings because of their link to enslaved people and the whole slave trade. And there was talk about, you know, could we have a slavery museum? And I think the Mayor of London is looking at that. And I would say, well, that may well be important, but let that not be the only thing we do in this space, because it, you know, it will just remind people of the trauma of being enslaved and what that meant for people of African descent. What we should be doing is saying, can we create these new empowering spaces that Black communities can thrive in and everyone can utilize? Actually, it doesn't necessarily need to be a solely Black thing, but it actually is centered around African-centric mentality that pushes back against a sort of white majority sort of perspective. And I think now is the time when we need to revisit some of the good bits about the GLC days, when assets, long-term assets, were given to communities, and think how well they've been used in many cases. We've got to go back to that. Otherwise, we're never going to get a level playing field, because how can we compete with these massive institutions with huge foundations, legacies, and all that sort of stuff? We're just tiny little specks in comparison to them as Black people. So I'm really interested, and a colleague of mine, Jermaine Jackman, held an online debate with 100 leading Black young people. Fantastic. The core of what they were asking was, we need an empowerment building or a series of them from which we can succeed and launch ourselves from. So I want this to be part of our debate as well, because it is about power sharing, it's about asset sharing, it's about leveling up. Because I think with those buildings and that financial foundation, and Carl earlier mentioned this notion of a national foundation or endowment for Black and ethnic minority communities, so we can set the terms of that investment, I think will be critical. And I know that there will be some, well, there are lots of corporations with links to the slave trade who are thinking, oh shit, we need to do something here. But we've got to make sure what they do is not tokenistic. I've heard that they're, you know, giving their Black staff small checks to spend on their favorite charities. No, come on, mate. It's a lot deeper than that. Don't try and get away with something that allows you just to tick a box and move on to the next thing. This has to be deep re-looking at investment and again, where money flows. I'll stop there. Probably ignited a debate, but assets.
Couldn't agree more with you, Jake. And part of that is building resilience in our community around our own asset base. Viv.
Yeah, your mic's a bit lowly. I'm not sure if anyone else is noticing that. But I agree with the point that Jake has made in broad terms. I've got an issue with the BAME word. I think we've got to be very, very precise in regards to, you know, the issues that, I mean, I opened by talking about the African Caribbean heritage community specifically. And when I connect it back to the George Floyd experience, that's what I'm talking about. The work that I and Black Socks more widely does in Africa is just a continuation of the same colonialism that we've seen playing out on a micro level in the conceptual West. We see it playing out with African countries across the board. And as Jake said, you know, there's been a round of street name changing and physical assets being given over to the community before, and yet we're still here. So I agree with it. I think how it's done is what's critically important. Who gets these buildings and how is it managed? These are the difficult conversations that don't happen. You know, my core competence is psychotherapy and social and European policy. So we know how the people in power can give the impression that they're giving away things, buildings and all the rest of it, but do it in a way that ensures that there's no long-term benefit from those actions. So I think that's absolutely right. in principle. How it's done is important. If there's a BAME endowment fund, that's great. But again, there are a lot of different groups that fall under that label. Many of them are white groups as well. So this is why I talk about slow, quick, slow, because it needs to be measured. It can't be reactive. There are, some immediate wins that can be had, but if we're talking about long-term, medium to long-term change, then there's more effort that will be required from those in influential positions in order to make that happen. I've been doing a fair amount of work with the Financial Conduct Authority. It regulates the 50,000 or so financial institutions in the UK, including the, nearly 3,000 banks, one of which I advise on. And they've been very quiet, and the financial sector has been very quiet generally, and really, it isn't a position to change the reality of the paradigm that we're in overnight. Same thing with Adland. They create, curate, and propagate a lot of the dysfunctional propaganda out there in the mainstream that perpetuates this dysfunctional historical colonial view of Black people and people of color more widely. So I'm just saying yes, but throwing these other bits into the mix. The 4 leadership programs that are in the process of being rolled out right now are a good example of some of the solutions. And there are many green shoots. It's our responsibility to make sure that those green shoots get all the sustenance and exposure to light, sunlight necessary for them to grow. So yeah,
I think that's absolutely right. I think that look, BAME is dead. I'm going to tell you that now from the Black community's perspective, from the Caribbean communities. BAME is dead. One understood that it was a useful way of describing all minorities for the purposes of, diversity headcounts in local authorities and elsewhere. But in relation to speaking about the reality of the Black experience, the anti-Black experience of racism, no longer serves a useful function, is now becoming offensive, largely because it's been abused as a term, as a means of not addressing the specifics. And a nuanced analysis of racism shows you that not all people of color suffer the same degree of socioeconomic exclusion or indeed institutionalized racism. And so we have to become more nuanced in relation to our articulation. And certainly from the perspective of the Black community, the African Caribbean heritage community, BAME is now passé, moved on. We need to speak about specific groups and specific issues in relation to those groups. That's not a denial of the alliance between minority groups, ethnic minority groups, well, actually ethnic majority groups, because African and Asian people form the majority of people on the planet. So it's not a breaking of that alliance, but it is an attempt to get a very much more laser-like and nuanced description of the realities of the way in which racism impacts differently on different communities. We have a lot of things in common, and we need to there are things that are entirely specific to each community. Islamophobia for the Muslim community, institutionalized racism for the African and Arab community, childbirth rates for Asian women, particularly Bangladeshi and Muslim communities, and I could go on speaking about that specificity. So let's declare BME dead for the purposes of this conversation. If you have it in your policy structures, please eradicate and replace with something entirely much more specific to those groups who definitely suffer socioeconomic exclusion and discrimination. It's coming up to 11:45. Would you believe it? The time warp that is Lee Jasper drive time makes time disappear in an instant. So I'm going to take the opportunity to, unless there are any final conclusion, well, what I'm going to do is go around and take concluding comments. So I think it's been a fantastic discussion so far. And I really think we could possibly do a series of these, to be frank, because I think there's so much more to deep dive on each particular aspect that you've raised. as to constitute a book. So we'll definitely be coming back to you to think about more about these discussions. But Mike, do you have any concluding summary thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's been, you're right. I mean, it's like a time warp, isn't it? It's just gone so quickly. So it's been a real privilege to be invited on and to participate. I think trying to read both the text and listen to the contributions of colleagues has been challenging for a man of my advanced years. I think that the one thing that I can really take away, just the very last comment, there's been stuff in the chat around tokenism, and I've been really careful not to make kind of tokenistic statements of intent. So, but one thing I could definitely take away right now in the organisation is the 100% elimination of the word BAME. And we'll try and find more appropriate terms. I'd be delighted to come back and have further conversations. I think there is a genuine commitment from my colleagues and myself around you. If we've got anything to offer in terms of size and scale, is to be a voice to help amplify, be a platform to help amplify the voices of people who are fighting for social justice.
Absolutely, thank you for that, Mike. Carl, how's it been for you?
Well, I might answer that in a couple of days' time when my colleagues at work find out I've been doing this, Lee. But there is a serious point there that a lot of my learning and so on is because of the work of my colleagues and I, before this program I would have said black and minority ethnic colleagues, but I'm now going to have to find some alternative language there. There is a serious point though that I don't feel I get many opportunities to sit down for a couple of hours and discuss these things in a way that enables me to talk with confidence without fear of getting it wrong. And I think you've created a sort of a conversation, Lee, where I felt like I can say what I really feel, and I find that really valuable. And I hope that will mean that I'm going to be a better ally in the future, because I'm not a very good one from what I can work out. So I really enjoyed it, and I'd really like the opportunity to sort of come back. And what's also been good about the conversation is that at various points we've had some optimism, because again, sometimes the conversations, they can feel very negative, like everything is getting worse, but actually there are elements of the conversation here that are really positive and identify a way forward. And I'm sort of like quite a practical man, and I do want to change things. I don't just want to talk about them. And the more we can focus on like the practical stuff that we can do, that really sort of, that's why I get up in the morning, Lee.
And we're glad you did this morning, Michael. Sherry?
No, I think like others, really, just grateful to have been invited along. I think for me, there are some reflections that I think there's a lot more conversation that needs to be had around language. I always talk about Black communities. For me, that's almost a political term, and I usually it lands okay. But as I mentioned earlier, Lee, when we've been talking about this at Safer London, we do have some people from white minority communities working at Safer London that struggle with that. So an open conversation about language would, I think, benefit lots of people. The second thing I would say is that I'm going to use this as a bit of a vehicle. Safer London is currently recruiting for staff and very shortly be recruiting for trustees. As anybody that heard me right at the beginning, that one of the things that I've proactively done is to ensure that we make the organisation representative of the communities we serve. So I hope that people have picked up our internet link off of here, and if people are interested in coming to work at Safer London or perhaps take up opportunities to be Black trustees, we're trying to increase the number of Black trustees we have, then please do that. So that was me doing a little bit of advertising since I've been here on Saturday morning and want to encourage people to engage with us. So sorry about that.
No, don't be sorry. We're delighted that you're putting the opportunity out there. So if you're interested in those positions, get on to Sherry. If you think Carl's onto something and want to help him have further conversations, get onto their website. Same with Change, Grow, Live. If you think you want to be part of supporting their efforts to change their culture, go to their websites and see what's available. Jake.
Thank you. I started off super nervous. Now I feel like I'm charged up, ready for the next.
Jasper effect.
I just need to find my shield and the sword, but I don't know which is which at the minute. So yeah, I mean, really excited by the conversation. It gives me hope that ethical leadership is alive and well in the UK, and certainly hearing from my white colleagues on this call, I very much believe that. Definitely think another drive time conversation about definitions, terminology is key. It's a live debate, and don't forget there are many people using the BAME term who are Asian or of African descent. So we need to help them decouple that. And I make the mistake daily, frankly, because it was indoctrinated in me. So it's going to take a while to sort of have that pass through my system, let's say. I definitely think a conversation about the economics of oppression would be very useful, Lee, and maybe if you could get some commissioners onto this sort of call just to ask them about how they work out and look, because I actually don't think when they're commissioning procuring services, they look at the impacts necessarily of how they're procuring. And I think for me, that's going to be a super live debate when the money starts to thin out and austerity kicks in even more. In Hackney, they've spent 70 million in the last 3-4 months as a council responding to COVID. So councils are going to be in a really difficult situation, as is the NHS. And then finally, I'd say that let's have a talk about the assets and what do for self really means for us as descendants of Africa. What does that really mean? And that, I think, would be a super important debate, because then we can be in alignment on that, because there are assets out there. There are assets within us. You know, me and my wife were we were just going through a process of fostering assessment, because we feel if we're bougies, as Viv has pointed out. I don't know how we can be that as Northerners, Lee, but I'll have to re-look at the book of definitions of bougie. But I mean more north than you. I'm a Lancastrian, mate. We were one of 3 black families in a population of 50,000. So we were special. You know what I mean? You know what it's like. But anyway, just coming back to, you know, what we can do as individuals, I'm really looking forward to being a foster parent, you know, and doing our little bit there, sharing our wealth. Not that we got loads, but, you know, sharing the cake. So anyway, thanks for having us on. Love to come back.
Okay, if we can put Sherry's contact details up on the screen. Mr. Theo in the studio, as people are asking for that contact details as we come to Viv. Viv, your concluding thoughts. If I may say, Viv, before you start, just a nod to the procurement and the asset base, because the program that we had on last week had a black guy, Adrian Benson, who was a procurement officer who procures over 1 billion government procurements, is responsible for that procurement process. And Aspire Education has a seminar, which I'm nudging Viv to speak about in his concluding section, and also talking about our assets base, its intellectual assets as well. And we have a very important survey that I'm sure he's going to pick up on. Over to you.
Thank you for that, Lee. Beautiful. Let me just deal with the just where I'm at with the whole thing emotionally. It's definitely been one of the healthier conversations I've been party to around this subject in my lifetime, because it has been a lifetime of conversations around it. In my earlier years, I spent more time running from gangs and all the rest of it than actually dialogue. So I think that's the first point. The positives, again, there are lots and lots of stuff that's going on across the country and internationally. that Black communities are driving. We've got our own bits. We've got the Open Minds Alliance that we are in the mid stages of rolling out. And that's again about ensuring that Black communities are determining what services they require in terms of prevention and early intervention around mental health support and well-being more widely. We've got many mainstream organizations already actively involved. Mind, the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. We've got all the key Black-led organizations tied in as well, so we're not fighting with each other. Black Thrive being one example that springs to mind. So again, this whole idea of partnership, leaders working jointly with each other is key to what we believe ethical leadership is about. We're doing a lot of succession planning and legacy work. The leadership stuff that's been the ring for which has been held by Hackney CVS and led by Jake. We're all very excited about. There's probably about 15 Black male leaders involved in that. And, we want, organizations, other mainstream organizations to get involved in this. Now, why is it an ethical leadership program? Because it will run whether it gets money going forwards or not. We're tying it into other opportunities once those programs are completed. We're looking for the best of the young people that come out of that so they can get even more intensive coaching and development. So as things go forwards in the future, the people that are moving into these corridors of power are individuals who understand what ethical leadership means. It's in their DNA. I'd say to the organizations that are looking to take people onto their board, let us help you redefine what the criteria needs to be. I've had those conversations with organizations before. We don't want you to keep recruiting individuals who are Black, but have no connection to Black organizations, don't understand themselves, what Black leadership really needs to look like when it's healthy, and don't do any real stuff in their community. I'm not saying any of you on this program have done this, but I'm just talking more generally for those that are listening to it. We know that lots of money isn't going to our communities. This is one of the reasons why, in partnership with Hackney CVS, Black Men for Change, Black Socks Aspire, has putting on two webinars. One's on the 10th of July, the other one's on the 17th of July, just literally talking about where the money is. And it's called Get the Money You Deserve. About 120 people have signed up already. 90% are Black women. So there's a bigger issue that we've touched on before about what's going on within the Black male community around things like this. We need to get that money that's available down into the community, and we can't leave the responsibility solely to mainstream organizations like NCVO and others to do the lifting. We've got to lift for ourselves. And then the last one is the education survey, because we know if we're talking about it from a public health perspective, education starts in the home, and too often the necessary support isn't there, or it's an intergenerational history of dysfunction that plays out in the next generation going forward. So we've got a national survey that's been driven by Aspire Education Group to find out what parents are concerned about as they are prepared to take their children back into school, what Black professionals within the education system are concerned about. You can get that information from about all of those things from Black Socks or info@blacksocks.com. It's on the thing going down. The .com's not on the end, so do make sure you get that on there. And I'll just end by saying, yes, Lee, another great show. I think this is number 8. You've got 2 more. So I think this one's probably a high point in terms of hitting, being on the pulse of what people are concerned about right now. Thank you, my colleagues, for being such an inspiration over the last 2 hours. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're adding one more drive time after it's going to be 13. I've been handbagged by Bella Blake to do a additional program on Black women in the music and promotion scene to counter the all-male program that we had, which was excellent last week. So we'll be adding just one more, and Bella will be co-hosting with me. But can I say to my guests this morning that it's been an absolute pleasure. I think we should do this again, quite frankly. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have. I would hope that you would encourage your fellow white colleagues in senior phase that Lee Jasper doesn't bite your leg off and batter you over the head with it when you talk to him about race issues, and that they can quite comfortably come on the show and have a sensible discussion with mature people about the issues at hand. You've been an inspiration in terms of the discussion. I'm sure people will go back and deep dive and look at it again. It will be on both platforms, Facebook and YouTube. It's there forever, unfortunately. So you will always be able to dip back in and look at what is said. But can I thank you all enormously for taking the time on your busy Saturday afternoons to be with me this morning. So as we say goodbye to our guests, it just remains for me to bring, as my father used to say, the boat into the harbour. And it's been a fascinating discussion today. And in many ways, I think that we are looking at a significant shift in relation to anti-racism. I think there's a new anti-racism. I think it's a paradigm shift that has taken place. Institutions inevitably catch up with the change in the social mood, and the social mood has moved, and now institutions need to move along with that. It can't be the kind of same old diversity initiatives just with an enhanced publicity budget that we've seen. It can't be public declarations followed by inaction and ignorance of the real dynamics of racial
Hi, my name's Lee Jasper. This is Brixton, London, and you're watching Lee Jasper Drive Time.